Hey everyone, welcome to Your Learn Lab. I'm Seema, and if you're an IGNOU student, you're in the right place. Here we create videos on different IGNOU courses to help you ace your exams. So hit subscribe and join me on this learning journey. Welcome to today's lesson on Spenser's poetry, where we move deeper into two of his most beautiful and richly crafted works, Epithalamion and Prothalamion. These poems are not just grand celebrations of marriage and public festivity. They are also windows into the poet's inner life, his hopes, anxieties, and his vision of harmony between earthly and the divine. We'll look closely at the structure and form of these poems, their symbolic and cultural resonance, and how Spenser blends personal emotion with classical and Renaissance ideals. By the end of this session, you'll understand not only the key themes and differences between these two works, but also how they reflect the distinctive voice of the poet who sought to elevate English poetry to the level of classical greatness. Let's begin. In our previous video, we explored Spenser's shorter poems, especially how they reflected a new poetic style shaped by the tradition of courtly love. In this unit, we shift our focus to two of his longer and more ambitious work, as we mentioned, the Epithalamion and the Prothalamion. These are his two great nuptial or wedding songs, both composed to celebrate marriage. But while they share a ceremonial form, they are remarkably different in the mood, intent, and poetic execution. To understand these differences, we also need to understand their literary heritage. The term Epithalamion comes from the ancient Greek, likely used first by the poetess Sappho. It literally means at the bridal chamber, and referred to the celebratory songs sung outside the bride's room on her wedding night. These poems often blended festivity with erotic undertones. Spenser follows this tradition in his Epithalamion, though with his own spiritual and personal twist. But for the Prothalamion, he invents a new term, Prothalamion, suggesting something that comes before the bridal chamber. And the poem reflects this shift. It is far more restrained, formal, and even political rather than sensual. As we move ahead, we'll explore the formal structure, literary devices, and deeper meanings behind these two poems. Let's begin with Epithalamion. Epithalamion is one of Spenser's most exuberant and artfully composed poems. This poem was written to mark Spenser's own wedding to Elizabeth Boyle, and it serves as the emotional and thematic conclusion to his earlier Amoretti sonnet sequence, which chronicled their courtship. Unlike the typical Renaissance poem that idealizes love from afar, Epithalamion celebrates something that is far more grounded: legitimate sexual desire between husband and wife. It's a hymn of joy, deeply personal, yet elevated through classical references and poetic form. In the final stanza, called the Envoy, Spenser describes the poem as a gift, an ornament in lieu of many ornaments, and an endless monument to his bride. This shows us how poetry itself became a substitute for material riches, a way of immortalizing love. But then the poem does more than just praise Elizabeth. It functions on multiple levels: as a celebration of the marriage day, a tribute to the beloved, a sanctification of passion, and a ceremonial performance. Spenser in turn adopts multiple personas. He is the poet crafting the lines, the lover gazing in adoration, the bridegroom waiting at the altar, the master of the ceremonies guiding the ritual, and finally the husband. This integration of roles and themes gives the Epithalamion a sense of unity. Even the brief final stanza, which might seem abrupt, contributes to the poem's overall coherence, like a final musical note that completes a harmonious composition. Now that we've seen the spirit and design behind Epithalamion, let's move forward to understand how Spenser structured his remarkable work. So, in this slide, we explored one of the most beautiful and profound elements in Epithalamion, its relationship with time. Spenser divides the poem into 24 stanzas, symbolizing the 24 hours of the wedding day. But he goes even further. There are 365 long lines, each with 5 or more poetic feet, representing the 365 days of the year. This fusion of structure and symbolism means the poem operates on two planes, the day of the wedding and the year of enduring love. What seems like a brief moment becomes a metaphor for a lasting union. The final stanza, called the Envoy, is unusually short, and Spenser himself jokingly refers to it as a hasty ending. But this is a poetic device. The abruptness isn't careless. It emphasizes the contrast between the fleeting moment and the eternal feeling it expresses. It leaves the reader with a sense that the joy of the day will echo far beyond it. This brings us to Spenser's spiritual and philosophical intention, to reconcile opposites. Epithalamion celebrates both earthly sensual love and divine transcendental love. In doing so, Spenser draws from the Platonic philosophy, which sees love as a ladder to the divine, and Christian morality, which sanctifies love within marriage. His poetry seeks to locate the eternal in the temporal. Love for Spenser is something we live in time. It has a day, place, a voice, but its resonance goes far beyond. It becomes a spiritual experience, a monument to joy. And in this way, time isn't just a structural feature. It becomes the poem's core theme. Time gives love its shape, its urgency, and its sacred meaning. Another one of the most subtle and beautiful ways Spenser structures Epithalamion is through the use of a refrain, a recurring line that evolves throughout the poem. The refrain begins as a hopeful echo in stanza 1. The woods shall to me answer and my echo ring. This line reappears in varied forms across the next stanzas, creating a sense of continuity. But the repetition is never dull, it's dynamic. Spenser uses these changes to show transformation over time, reflecting how even in permanence, change is inevitable. Let's take a closer look at the two key symbols in this refrain. The words, which seem solid and eternal, actually change slowly with time. They grow, decay, renew. The echo, by contrast, is brief and fragile. It holds the illusion of lasting, but it inevitably fades away. So even in this single line, Spenser captures the tension between the lasting and the fleeting, a core idea of the poem. Then from stanza 17 onwards, there is a dramatic shift. The refrain becomes negative. The words no more shall answer, nor your echo ring. This shift isn't arbitrary. The poem's first 16 stanzas correspond to the hours of daylight, full of celebration and light. The remaining 8 stanzas reflect the hours of darkness when doubt, anxiety, and silence creep in. This numerical symmetry isn't just poetic cleverness, it's deeply meaningful. It reflects the natural rhythm of the day and suggests that even joy must pass into shadow. The celebratory tone of the earlier stanzas is counterbalanced by the emotional uncertainty of stanzas 18 and 19, where Spenser voices deep personal anxieties. This balance between light and dark, certainty and fear, mirrors the experience of love and life itself. By using the refrain as a kind of musical motif, Spenser creates a poetic rhythm that mimics the turning of time, always moving, never static. The shifting refrain gave Epithalamion a rhythmic sense of time passing, of light turning into darkness, joy tinged with reflection. But beyond its lyrical structure, the poem also unfolds like a miniature drama, with stages of action, emotion, and ritual. Let's now break down the 5 key movements that shape the dramatic arc of the poem. Beyond its symbolic structure, Epithalamion is also dramatic in its progression. It's not just a lyrical meditation. It unfolds like a stage celebration, almost like a 5-act play. The poem opens with a traditional invocation to the muses, but Spenser does something more imaginative. He invites them not just as a poetic inspiration, but as active participants in the wedding, asking them to serve as bridesmaids. Along with them come the fairy hours, symbolic of time, and the 3 graces, handmaidens of Venus, the goddess of love. In stanza 5, Spenser places the poem in a pastoral landscape, a poetic tradition that allows for both idealization and sensual festivity. This setting enhances the dramatic feel and gives space for the orgiastic celebrations described later. The action of the poem unfolds in 5 distinct movements. Stanzas 1 to 8 set the tone, invoking divine inspiration, explaining the poem's purpose, and establishing the setting. Stanzas 9 to 13 follow the bride as she awakens, is adorned, and enters the church. It's a gentle yet celebratory sequence that builds to the wedding itself. Stanzas 14 to 17 brings in the revelry after the wedding, the dancing, the music, and the bridegroom's growing impatience for their union. Stanzas 18 to 24 shift into a more introspective tone. The poem expresses fears, doubts, and pleads for the blessings of various gods for a lasting union. Finally, the envoy, the brief last stanza, ties it all together. It reflects on the entire day, offering the poem itself as a lasting gift, a monument to love. By structuring Epithalamion this way, Spenser moves us through a full emotional journey, from hope and beauty to passion and anxiety, ending in a sacred affirmation. Up to this point, we've examined Epithalamion as a beautifully structured poetic performance. Spenser divides the poem into 5 dramatic movements, from the invocation and setting to the bride's adornment, the wedding ceremony, the post-marital celebrations, and finally the poet's prayers and anxieties. The structure gives the poem its ritual and theatrical quality, transforming a single day into a symbol of eternal harmony. Yet, within this grandeur, a curious absence becomes apparent. The bride, though central to the poem's celebration, is almost entirely voiceless. Her presence is orchestrated, described, admired, and moralized, but she is never allowed to speak or act. She is positioned as a symbol, not a subject, a repository of virtue, beauty, and divine order, but not of emotion, doubt, or individuality. This erasure of the feminine self is not incidental. It's structurally embedded in the poem's vision of love. What we encounter, particularly in stanzas 10 and 11, is a highly aestheticized and idealized representation of the beloved, one that reflects the poet's own moral and poetic framework far more than any real engagement with the bride as a person. In stanza 10, Spenser offers a lush poetic catalogue of beloved's physical beauty. This is a classic example of the Petrarchan blazon, a poetic device where the female body is broken into isolated, idealized features. Her lips are likened to cherries, her breast to cream, her neck to a marble tower. The cumulative image is not of a whole person but a composite ideal, a carefully curated vision of femininity built from visual pleasure. This culminates in the palace metaphor, all her body like a palace fair, ascending up with many a stately stair. Her body becomes a symbolic space, not a lived one, something to be admired, not inhabited. She becomes structure, not subject. The poetic gaze aestheticizes and elevates, but also displaces. She is not allowed to exist outside the frame of male vision. In stanza 11, it takes the palace metaphor a step further, moving from outer beauty to inner virtue. But even here, the beloved is not given a voice. Instead, her interior is populated by personified qualities: chastity, modesty, sweet love, and unspotted faith. These are not felt or expressed by her. They are installed within her by the poet's moral framework. Virtue is imagined as a queen on a throne, and base affections, code for desire, are imagined as servants who obey her laws. This reflects a typical feudal and Protestant order, where female sexuality is contained, hierarchized, and governed. The bride becomes a space where morality dwells, rather than a person who acts. Her moral value is emphasized only insofar as it fits the poetic vision of a legitimate Protestant love, chaste, orderly, and spiritually uplifting. Finally, we must consider the economic undercurrent in Epithalamion. While the poem appears to celebrate spiritual love, it is embedded in a world of exchange, hierarchy, and social ambition. The bride is called a merchant's daughter, not a noblewoman. In stanza 2, Spenser speaks of the ussury of long delight, suggesting that love is bound up in accumulation, cost, and return. These metaphors suggest that marriage is not just a sacred ritual, it is also a transactional agreement deeply tied to social class and moral legitimacy. The beloved then is not just a muse or a partner, she is a moralized possession shaped by the combined forces of poetry, patriarchy, and Protestant economy. As we step back from our close reading of Epithalamion, it is important to reflect on the poem's place within the literary landscape of the 16th century. This is not just a personal love lyric or a religious hymn. It is quite possibly the first explicitly self-declared English wedding poem. And it achieves a rare poetic synthesis, a celebration that is deeply sensual, yet morally disciplined, rooted in myth and classical antiquity, yet shaped by Protestant Christian belief. In stanza 19, for instance, we find imagery drawn from local English folklore, ghosts, goblins, and spirits of the night, a far cry from the stately invocations of the Muses or the Graces. Yet, these disparate elements cohere, and the result is a rich tapestry of poetic language and symbolic resonance. What makes Epithalamion truly unique is its ability to hold together what seems like oppositional traditions, pagan and Christian, sensual and spiritual, intimate and public, without compromising on poetic integrity. Spenser would attempt this on a much larger scale in The Faerie Queene, but many critics viewed Epithalamion as his most seamless and successful fusion of diverse traditions. It remains a landmark in English poetry, not only as a formal innovation, but as a testament to the possibilities of poetic synthesis in the Renaissance. We now begin our study of Prothalamion, a formal wedding ode composed by Spenser in 1596 for the double marriage of Elizabeth and Catherine Somerset. The term Prothalamion is a Spenserian invention, a deliberate attempt to define a new poetic form, the prenuptial song, distinct from the more personal Epithalamion. The occasion was ceremonial and public, and so is the tone of the poem. Spenser's language here is dignified, restrained, and more focused on public honor than private passion. That said, the poem retains many features from Epithalamion, such as its pastoral imagery, especially the tranquil river Thames, and a repeated closing couplet adapted as a refrain across stanzas. In this closing invocation from stanza 6 displayed here, we see Spenser return to classical allusions. He calls on the Venus and the Cupid to smile on the brides and to dispel all discord from their union. Whose smile, they say, hath virtue to remove or lose dislike and friendship's faulty guile. This reflects Spenser's continued effort to merge pagan poetics with Christian reformist ideals of moral and social harmony. Although Prothalamion shares surface features with Epithalamion, a refrain, a pastoral setting, and classical allusions, the resemblance ends there. Unlike the earlier nuptial poem, Prothalamion makes no attempt to depict the wedding night, festive celebrations, or even the emotional richness of marriage. Its focus is limited to the ceremonial procession down the Thames leading toward the Essex house. The invocation is brief, and the refrain, though beautiful, lacks the nuanced variation of Epithalamion, making the poem feel repetitive and less dynamically structured. The entire action is compressed into just a few morning hours, so the rich integration of time and emotion that we saw in Epithalamion is absent here. What we do get instead is elaborate allegory. The Somerset daughters are likened to swans, symbols of grace and purity sailing the Thames. Spenser even alludes to the classical myth of Jove and Leda, only to suggest that these brides surpass Leda in beauty. But the deeper tone of the poem is one of melancholy. In this excerpt from stanza 1, Spenser opens with a personal confession of disappointment. He speaks of his long fruitless stay at court, of idle hopes and empty shadows. This tone of quiet alienation gives Prothalamion a depth that goes beyond its public purpose. In the next slide, we'll consider how Prothalamion functions not just as a poem of occasion, but as a coded self-expression of political disillusionment. What makes Prothalamion particularly striking is the unexpected tone with which it opens. Rather than diving into ceremonial praise, Spenser begins with a lament, a reflection on his disillusionment with courtly life, and the fruitless stay he has endured waiting for recognition that never came. In these early lines, we hear a poet struggling with professional stagnation, with idle hopes that vanish like shadows, and these emotions are highly personal. And their presence in what is supposedly a celebratory wedding ode is both surprising and telling. We see this discontent surface again in stanza 8, where Spenser reflects on the death of the Earl of Leicester, his longtime patron. The phrase "my friendless case" suggests not just loss but betrayal by a system that treats patrons as interchangeable, but leaves poets emotionally adrift. The formal tone of the wedding ode then becomes a kind of mask, a structure Spenser uses to air his private frustrations under the guise of public celebration. In this light, Prothalamion is less about the brides and more about the poet's political and emotional isolation, in a courtly world that promises support but offers little permanence. To wrap up our analysis, let's compare the two poems side by side. Epithalamion is Spenser's deeply personal expression, a celebration of his own marriage that weaves together sensuality, spirituality, myth, and time into richly layered poetic experience. Prothalamion, by contrast, is a commissioned public poem, structured, ceremonial, and emotionally distant. While it echoes some of the formal strategies of Epithalamion, like the refrain, the pastoral setting, and mythological references, it lacks the same level of thematic integration or emotional intensity. One of the most striking differences lies in the voice of the poet. In Epithalamion, Spenser is the joyful groom. In Prothalamion, he is the disenchanted courtier, airing frustrations under the mask of formal celebration. In both poems, Spenser showcases his technical mastery, but it's the interplay of personal and public voices, particularly in Prothalamion, that invites deeper reading. Together, these two works offer us a study in contrasts between private desire and public duty, between idealized love and political disappointment, and between the poetic imagination and the reality of Elizabethan court life. Let's now pull together everything we've explored in this unit. We began by studying two of Spenser's most significant longer poems, Epithalamion and Prothalamion. Though both are nuptial odes, they operate on different registers. Epithalamion as a personal celebration of marriage and Prothalamion as a more reserved public tribute. Across both poems, we note how Spenser blends multiple poetic traditions: Christian symbolism, Greco-Roman mythology, and even pre-Christian folklore. This ability to fuse disparate influences becomes Spenser's defining poetic gifts and laid the groundwork for his later, more ambitious project, The Fairy Queen. We also considered how these poems are not merely artistic works, but cultural documents, reflecting Spenser's own life, especially his frustration with courtly politics and the broader anxieties of Renaissance authors working under a fragile system of patronage. Above all, we saw the Spenser spirit was pioneering, opening up new possibilities for English poetry. His influence stretches into the next generation, especially in poets like John Milton, who will carry forward and expand upon Spenser's rich legacy of myth, morality, and poetic ambition. Let us now look at how Epithalamion and Prothalamion have appeared in previous IGNOU exam papers. The most frequently asked question is a comparative analysis. Compare and contrast Epithalamion and Prothalamion as wedding songs. This has appeared multiple times in June 2014, 2019, 2023, and again in 2024. So it's a clear favorite and a must-prepare topic. Another recurring question is on time and temporality, especially Spenser's use of the symbolic structure of time in Epithalamion versus the compressed temporal setting in Prothalamion. That was asked in December 2017. There's also the broader question that includes both poems indirectly, that is, identify the most influential factors that shaped Spenser's career as a poet. That came in December 2020, and you'd be expected to use examples from both the poems, but you would be expected to know more about Spenser's life as well. In question number 1, the reference to context section, lines from Epithalamion like the refrain or the stanza praising virtue, they have been used multiple times, and most recently they appeared in December 22 and 23. Let's now switch gears a bit and try to find out how you can approach exam questions on Epithalamion and Prothalamion, whether it's a long answer or a reference to context question. Now, for the long answer questions, begin with the context. Briefly introduce Spenser's background, his role in the Elizabethan court, and the significance of patronage. Also talk a bit about how the political leanings were during the time as well. Define the genre, then what do you mean by an Epithalamion or a Prothalamion, what's the tradition behind the wedding ode, and so on. Then move into close reading. Use short relevant quotations to support your points, like the refrain "Sweet Thames runs softly" or the palace metaphor for the bride in Epithalamion. Discuss themes like time, marriage, political alienation, and female idealization. If the question asks for comparison, be sure to highlight structural, tonal, and thematic contrast between both the poems. Private versus public, joyful versus restrained, sensual versus allegorical. Finally, conclude by reflecting on Spenser's poetic achievement, how he fuses classical, Christian, and folkloric elements, and how this sets the stage for the fairy queen and later poets like Milton. For reference to context, always name the poem and speaker, paraphrase the lines in context, comment on imagery, tone, or symbolism, and tie it back to the poem's larger themes. If you do this in a clear, structured way, you'll be able to write effective and high-scoring answers. And that's it. So thank you for joining today. All the best for your exam. Do add your comments to let me know how you found this video. If you did find this video helpful and would like to learn more, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to Your Learn Lab. See you in the next one. Until then, happy learning.